So Image Comics in the early 90s, comics in the early 90s were a big thing for kids. Not like just because I was into comics, like comics were huge. And one of the biggest comic companies was Image Comics. It was particularly when they were debuting. And Youngblood, the first issue, was a huge deal. When that first issue came out, I remember kids in the schoolyard being like, have you heard about Youngblood? And we're telling people about it in detail before it even came out. The hype for Youngblood was crazy. So that was in the early 90s. By the mid-90s, it became pretty clear that Image was going to be made into cartoons. You had the Wildcats one that came out in the 94-95 season on CBS and only lasted one season, and tried to go against X-Men, which seems to be a similar story to what happened with Youngblood. Youngblood, the cartoon, I had previously heard when I was a kid, and remember reading in Wizard Comics, but couldn't find for this, that it was pitched to ABC, and ABC found it to be too violent, or they made some pitch for ABC and they thought it was too violent. I have not been able to find out if that was verified. I did remember hearing people talk about that in comic book stores and things like that. Maybe that was true, maybe it wasn't, maybe ABC saw the comic, we're like, I'm not doing this. Basically what happened with this is they did animate some stuff for it, and it was actually going to happen on the Fox Kids network, and it was supposed to be on the same Saturday morning block as X-Men. There seems to be some conflicting reports that it was going to replace X-Men in the 95-96 season. I sort of doubt that. That was around the time they were doing the Phoenix saga for the X-Men animated show, and they clearly had a lot of faith in them because they let them do Phoenix for an entire season, and I know that's been hailed as one of the better seasons of that show. So I really don't think that was what was going to happen. I know Mark Silvestri said that they were going to replace X-Men. That's not the case. But they were developing this, and they developed this with an animation studio called Roustabout Productions, which I've found nothing about. They basically like made this Youngblood thing and nothing. And they've only made two things with this, which was presumably sort of like a character introduction thing that looked really rough. It's sort of, the animation reminds me of MTV's Head, which at some point I should review. And they made another sequence which came out on YouTube in 2013, which is a little more detailed and shows promise. I think it could have been something. But what happened basically with the Youngblood show is they were going to pitch this as an hour block with Youngblood and a Cyber Force cartoon, which was from Mark Silvestri. Youngblood was from Rob Liefeld. It was going to be an hour block. It didn't have a name, basically. It wasn't going to be the Image Comics block. Maybe it was, but that was the idea. That was the concept. And they never really drew or animated anything for Cyber Force. I couldn't find anything. If you can, put it in the comments of this video or something. But the Youngblood cartoons actually look cool. I think especially the sequence they did and the opening thing I thought was pretty cool. They animated these things and presented it to Fox, and Saban found out about this, and Saban and Marvel made Fox sign an exclusive deal to only make basically Marvel superhero shows, or maybe if it was adapted from a comic, it could only be from Marvel or something like that. I'm fairly certain that deal made Silver Surfer happen in Avengers, so forth. Yeah, they basically made it so the Image shows couldn't happen because they didn't want that competition. So they were just scrapped entirely. And Roustabout Productions, I know it was said Nick Dubious was the creator, and he said the Youngblood series, would take a lighthearted approach with tongue-in-cheek humor. Not exactly sure what that means with Youngblood, but they were really putting a lot of effort into it, but it never came to pass. The Youngblood animation they did create ended up being in ads for Youngblood toys, which I don't remember at the time, but if you watch the ads, looks like they have a rapping Rob Liefeld, even though it's definitely not Rob Liefeld. Image Comics never really got to make that many animated shows. They did in the mid-90s. Actually, 95 was the peak year of animation from Image Comics. You got the end of the Wildcat show on CBS. You also had the Savage Dragon show on USA from 1995 to 96, which got about 26 episodes, I believe, maybe more. You have Spawn was on HBO from 97 to 99. That was probably the most hailed of all of them. The Max was also on an MTV in 1995. So basically the mid-90s was peak for Image Comics. We still don't have a lot of Image Comics stuff being made or media of it, but it was kind of a big thing in the 90s. Image Comics was everywhere. It was like Spawn in particular and Wildcats. Youngblood debuted really high, but it like never really became a big title. Like I remember being swept up in the hype for Youngblood, but it took so long for 2 to come out that I didn't really care about them as much. Whereas Wildcats, like by the time issue 2 came out, I wasn't reading the comic as much. But Wildcats, like I knew every issue. And then, especially by the mid-90s, Gen 13 had hit and other things. But it is interesting, there was this Youngblood cartoon that made it pretty far. And it's been talked about at comic conventions. Everybody thought it could have been a promising cartoon. I don't really believe that because the brand just wasn't strong enough. Wildcats, there was a lot of hype around. But it is odd that Image, they basically made X-Men clones. If you look at the Wildcats character designs, if you look at the Youngblood character designs, if you look at the Cyberforce character designs, everyone had a fucking Wolverine. Everyone had this character and that character. It was just a ripoff of another one. It was fairly obvious. So going up against X-Men didn't work. Wildcats tried with CBS. They aired at the same time as X-Men. I'm going to be honest with you. I didn't watch a lot of Wildcats, even though the theme song I loved. It was like, I won't sing. It was like, Wildcats will talk to people. I don't even remember the thing. But Wildcats didn't hit because eventually you're just going to watch X-Men because it was a good show. I get why, because you had hits like X-Men and Batman the Animated Series. Image, I think it had a lot of promise, but the Max show is probably the best one. I've heard a lot of acclaim for the Spawn show. But Youngblood has always been a fascination of mine, the cartoon, just because I always heard when I was a kid, throughout the 90s, it was too violent to be approved. And now that I'm an adult, I'm like, so a production company would spend a ton of money on a cartoon show for Saturday morning that no one would get to watch because it wouldn't be approved. Doesn't make any sense. But if you watch the animation of the theme song part and the extended part, you kind of see some cool stuff there. I think it could have been sort of neat. I wish they had kind of worked out a deal or gone to another network. I think it could have been a cool, one season wonder. But Wildcats wasn't a great cartoon. The Max certainly was. I would love to review that one day. Other things like that. But Image just didn't become this big thing, because I think also you can't just keep ripping off the X-Men and the other Marvel characters, and they weren't the best written. And I think Youngblood was the extreme of that. But it's always been kind of this lost big animated project to me. And I didn't know about the Cyberforce thing until now. And there's nothing been really made of it that's ever been released of it. And the Youngblood stuff has sort of leaked out over the years. But and I know they made a cool Youngblood set for a Comic-Con. They did put a lot of money behind Youngblood, hoping it would be promise of more stuff, but that's never materialized. I do think Image Comics, if Netflix made a cool Image Youngblood movie, I think people would come out for it, or a Youngblood cartoon. I still think the promise is there for it. I think they should do it at one point. But it's kind of interesting to think about a major 90s comic book that almost got a promising cartoon show. And from Roustabout Productions, I think, which never got its shot, and having that production company killed by an exclusive deal from a company that had all its number one shows. And, I don't know if they were right to do it, and I don't know if the Youngblood would have really hurt them as much as they thought it would, but, they basically showed, don't fuck with us, we're Marvel, and we have all your cards, and sort of killed them in the process, even if they couldn't kill Image Comics themselves. It's sad that it didn't happen, because part of me, it's like a cool cartoon that I wish could have been something, but never got to. So, anyway, that is the deal with the Youngblood cartoon. The extreme 90s cartoon that never got to be truly extreme.